All right, thank you for coming back, everyone. Thank you. We've had a great morning so far. We're going to turn you over. We're very, very fortunate to bring you. We've actually got some of the top panel moderators in the world, and exceptional collective. You know, and also now we're going to migrate into the world, the frightening world of infrastructure. You know, that's what I'm doing. We talked about communications. And now we're going to talk about the antithesis of communications, which is infrastructure.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I guess we'll start off by having each panelist introduce themselves. We can start with you, Doug.
Sure. Doug Johnson, and I'm tending to my own consulting business these days, but I've spent a career, the second half of my career with Sun Microsystems, doing various technology evangelization within the Department of Defense and government customers, but more recently working on technology standardization, and in particular emerging technology standardization. So actually these days I'm continuing that, looking at standardization that would help cloud computing become more of a reality for more people. So that's what I've been fooling around lately.
Hi, I'm Matthew Conway. I'm the VP of Engineering at Backupify. Backupify essentially backs up your cloud data, consumers' cloud data, moving into the business space as well. I start there today. But I do have a fair amount of experience in cloud infrastructure for the last 3 years. I've been at a mobile internet startup, and all of our infrastructure was built on the cloud. And so very heavy user of cloud infrastructure at any rate. This is my first OIL conference, and it's been good so far.
John?
Oh, good morning. My name is John Melini. I'm the CEO of a company called CloudSwitch, and I apologize in advance for my raspy voice. It's been a rough week fighting a cold. CloudSwitch is a startup company based in Burlington, Massachusetts, focusing on helping companies move existing applications that they have inside of their enterprise to the cloud. And the goal of doing that is to do it seamlessly with no changes to the application. We can talk more about why that's important, but essentially helping lower the barrier for people to adopt the cloud for their applications. Prior to CloudSwitch, I had taken some time off, but for, gosh, the better part of 11 years, I was at a company called SolidWorks, which was when I joined, we were a small startup company, and I was the CEO there for the last 7+ years. And I know that Bolin is a user of SolidWorks.
Okay, I guess what we're going to do is start off with some basic questions here. If we've got an existing IT infrastructure that's stable, why would we want to move to the cloud? What are some of the reasons why people are moving? You want to start, Doug?
Boy, I've got to say that my second definition for legacy systems are systems that work and you don't want to screw around with. So I really got to say that you probably don't want to do anything. Cloud has a couple of things going for it that is different. By the way, I hate the term cloud. It's the opposite of transparent, right? It's the fuzzy thing, it's the abstracted, and somebody else takes care of it, and you hope they're doing it well, but there's no way to actually tell if they're doing it well these days. But the reasons one might consider it for things is the same reason why you outsource stuff or you co-locate stuff. You want it, you want it out of your care. You want somebody else to take care of it. And with cloud in particular, the unlimited resources is always bandied about. And I guarantee it's not really an unlimited resource, but it's certainly bigger than what you could muster on your own. That is really, really important because as one looks at internet traffic and buying practices and all sorts of, sort of anything in communication, it's very spiky traffic. It doesn't gradually rise and gradually fall, but rather something happens and then your sale goes on, and all of a sudden you have 10 times the traffic that you had before. Cloud is a very good place for addressing that kind of stuff. Cloud is another good place. I'm a strong believer. I'm kind of a technical or technological elitist. Cloud is a place where often you can have professionals take care of things rather than you. everybody is, of course, an IT administrator with their own laptop and their own PC. Who does their backups with any sort of regularity? That's a shelf for you. You only back up after you've been burned, because everybody knows there's two kinds of disk drives, those that have failed and those that are about to fail. Everything else is...
Another non-sponsor.
I think ultimately one would use the cloud to gain a certain level of professionalism and expertise in something that again, it's better, it's cheaper, it's more appropriate for you to pay for it rather than to do it in-house. Unless it's your core competency, which of course both of these guys have cloud as a core competency.
I guess I'll go next. Go on the line. So, obviously it's a harder sell for people that already have an existing investment in their own technology. It's much easier for a startup, say, to decide to use the cloud because, they just get so much more from it. However, if you have an existing business, I'd imagine there are probably two reasons you might want to use the cloud. The first, as you said, if something's working, you want to leave it alone, but that works for you don't want to break your existing production by deploying something really risky. You might want to use a third party to deploy to just to test something out. Basically, it's a good place for your skunk work projects. It's a lot easier to get clearance for 3 months of a recurring expense than it is to get a server, assigned to you. I'd imagine in a large corporation. So, in that respect, the cloud does give you that flexibility for innovation. So you'll be able to try something new and just get it out there and see if it works.
So I think one of the biggest advantages of the cloud, and I think it's important to just take a step back and define what we mean by cloud, and I'll do that in a moment, is the ability to do something that rarely people talk about, and that is to turn things off. The real benefit of the cloud is that you have flexibility to turn things on, scale it, and turn things off. But to give some context to explain maybe a little bit more about the cloud, there's sort of a common topology that's already pretty much been accepted by the industry, which is that if you think about it kind of a pyramid, there's really three ways to think about the cloud. There's software as a service that everybody's very quite familiar. The poster child for that, of course, is Salesforce.com. And then there's a kind of a mid-tier layer that people talk about as PaaS, or Platform as a Service. And examples of that are Google with their App Engine, or Force.com from Salesforce.com. And that's kind of a higher level of abstraction of the cloud that allows you to develop and build things that have kind of core elements or core components. And then at the lowest level is something that's called infrastructure as a service. And that's kind of the bare, raw computing and storage capacity. And a great example of the poster child for that, of course, is Amazon, and now there's lots of other people that are trying to create public clouds. And I would argue there certainly is the old maxim that if it's not broken, don't fix it. But I think what happens is most companies don't realize the cost for a lot of their existing applications and the lack of flexibility with a lot of their existing applications. So if you go through any data center, there's tons of servers that are being taken up by applications that people don't even really know how often or when they're being used, what they're being used for. And if there was a way that they could take those applications and move them to the cloud, you're freeing up a lot of expensive real estate, the power, the cooling, and then when they're being used, of course, you pay for that usage. But if they're not being used, you certainly could shut them down. And that's not something that internally people do today or would do. And so the question, and this is the reason that CloudSwitch was started, is kind of help solve some of those fundamental problems, which is what does it take to move some of those applications that are rarely used and move them to the cloud? And we think there's a lot of flexibility that you get by freeing up that space, that hardware, that ability for things that might be more mission critical that you'd never want to put on the cloud.
Are you also working with companies that have existing software packages already, say accounting packages, or we just looked at a new estimating package in our business. So you're helping those companies develop their product to go the route of a Salesforce or that type of application?
So yeah, a good question. So there are there's a boatload of startups that have built applications, and essentially they're outsourcing the infrastructure to the likes of Amazon. And it makes a ton of sense. I mean, that's why I ended up joining CloudSwitch. I spent some time with some local venture capitalists after getting tired of kind of being at home and getting a little restless and wanting to do something. And I noticed that, I like big words like all every, or exclusive words like none, and all of the startups I looked at, all of them were using Amazon for their infrastructure. None of them were building out their own infrastructure. So, like canaries in the coal mine, it kind of validated the shift, and this platform shift of the cloud. And so I spent a lot of time then looking at companies, looking at things in the cloud, and I realized that there's a lot of, where all the money is being spent today is on existing applications and existing infrastructure. And the question is, how do you lower the barrier for companies to be able to take advantage of the cloud? So we're not doing a lot to help kind of raw startups take applications and move them to the cloud. And because they can develop, specifically to the APIs of Amazon or Terramark or Rackspace or any number of providers. We're focusing on people who have existing applications. Now, those existing applications can be commercial, sort of off-the-shelf type of applications. One of our beta customers, for example, was using Siebel for their CRM system. And, people think of, I'll point it out, they're not a sponsor as well, so I can say whatever disparaging remarks I want. But actually, we used to use Siebel at SolidWorks. But with each new release of Siebel, people would take this commercial package and they'd have all their own customizations as well. So when a new release came out, it was a pretty grueling process to go through and vet that the new release was okay and that all of the modifications they had made would work. And so the IT team, when they were planning for a new release, would go and buy 6 or 7 Onken servers, kind of put them in the data center, kind of go vet out, test that whole new application, the new version of it, and then when it was ready, kind of shift it over and say, okay, we can go ahead and use that as our production system. Well, that's pretty expensive when you look at that kind of exercise. You're talking about $75,000 to $100,000 worth of expense to kind of validate the new release. And when you look at it all in terms of the cost, if you could take that and move that whole stack, that whole kind of application data, move that whole thing out to the cloud, go through and run all the tests you want to run, essentially rent those servers for 3-4 months, and when you're done, shut them down. You could get it at a third of the cost, a quarter of the cost. And it's not just kind of the cost. Anybody knows in any kind of enterprise, you're trying to get IT who's, quite frankly, overburdened, overworked. You look at the expenditures in IT, the budgets for most of these departments, a lot of them are fixed. It's called depreciation. So they don't have a lot of flexibility. So when people were forced to cut costs during this last downturn, what did they do? They cut people. And they cut people, if you looked at the pie chart in the past, and you sort of said how many people were IT people versus application people, I can assure you that today that pie chart is slanted towards there's a lot more application people on a percentage basis versus infrastructure people. So this is a team that's already overwhelmed, and there's fewer people being able to respond to the needs and demands of the rest of the engineering community. So now, add on the fact that there's budget costs and pressures to kind of buy new capital, add to the fact that there's less people to kind of get those servers, pull them out of the box, load them up, get everything set. When you can sit there and say, okay, now I can move something up to the cloud with relative ease, I'll say relative because it still work, but not have the kind of delays of purchasing, the delays of getting the hardware in, getting it set up. You're talking about business agility that allows you to basically prove out that new version of Siebel or whatever else and get it online, months earlier than you would be able to do if you had to buy it yourself. So that's the fundamental shift that we're seeing in terms of why people want to look at the cloud.
Okay. I wanted to see if we could talk a little bit about security issues that surround some of these applications that are out there, and also industry standards. Is there any kind of movement to develop standards?
The standards arena is a kind of a complex arena of self-appointed standards bodies who are supported by their vendors that come in and work and create standards within venues that help them. Cloud in particular, just separating out, looking at the standards arena within cloud, is interesting because you've got early days, right? Standards are usually or often come in after the battle and anoint the victors and standardize on what lived through the war. Cloud is early days, and as almost always in early days, the first movers, the Amazons and Googles and Salesforces, are actually not at all interested in standardization. They don't show up. at these meetings, because the hope here for each of them is that the strength of their offering and the strength of their market position will grow to the point where they become de facto standards, lowercase standards, as we say, the way things get done. And you know, they might be open at some level, you know, and closed at other levels. I mean, that's a continuum as well. But right now they aren't playing, and so the standards bodies themselves are busy, first of all, trying to figure out what their portfolios of existing standards have to do with cloud. And for most of them, it's a lot, because there's very little about cloud that is new. It's here because probably, I would say, two technological innovations that have become really important in driving. One is that the wide access and bandwidth that is available over the network. The fact that the internet is penetrating very, very far and is providing very cheap and low latency bandwidth to virtually anyone, anywhere. That's real important. The other piece is virtualization, the ability to actually take a server and instead of having, you know, dice it up and slice it up to reach much higher levels of utilization, so that the users don't know, and that's really important too. Those two things together, I think, are why cloud computing is now a possibility. The standards are going to come, well, standard bodies themselves are trying to figure out, well, what more do we have to do than we've done already in SOA, in network-based authentication and access controls? What more do we have to do to make it cloud-ready, cloud-worthy? And I think it drives back. Kevin yesterday, one of the Orland folks, said cloud computing is abstracted computing. And abstract to me means somebody else worries about it. It's opaque to me, okay, because I throw in the stuff I want, and it works. And I think cloud computing is this abstract computing. The things I want to do work, which means that all of this, you know, security, all of these functions, all these abilities that you're actually going to need within cloud computing need to come automatically and with little user input and a level of comfort that it's been handled correctly. So the level of automation and automatic provisioning, upsizing, downsizing, all of those things, and the level at which it works without the user having to twist knobs and change configuration files is extremely important. So that's actually where I think most of the sort of most valuable standardization will come from. To take all of these great, and I would challenge that probably there's not any particular technological issue that's needed for cloud computing that hasn't been addressed, at least at some level, with standards already. What you need is best practices. You need some provisioning and automation going on with that so that it works, you know, seamlessly and smoothly. But then you need housekeeping seals of approval for these things, profiles and best practices approaches for these things. So, and that's where, you know, and standards has a big role to play there as well. And there's a real comfort level.
Matt, what do you feel some of the largest security issues are?
Well, in terms of security, as you know, Doug was saying, this Doug, right? Yeah. Security is very complicated. Nobody ever gets it 100% right. A lot of the security standards I've seen are, you know, yay thick, and to read through them and cross all the T's and dot all the I's is very hard. And in that respect, it's very hard to have a standard that people will follow and make it successful and not fix the real weakness, which is, you know, the weak link, which tends to be people, not the actual security protocols out there. There's a lot of security in the industry that is done very well. I mean, you know, SSL works really well. You know, encryption works really well. But all the best encryption in the world doesn't really help if you give out your password. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's hard to address. I don't know the right answer to that. What we're thinking of doing at Backupify is, obviously we want to protect the user's data, and we do that in a number of ways. We can encrypt it. We can store the data in their own stores so that we don't have control over it. You know, we can, you know, also take sort of proactive things for people that don't really care about security, and you know, try and make it so that their data is inviolate, that no matter what somebody who has their credentials does, the data doesn't actually go away, or obviously you can still snoop on it, but at least they won't lose anything. So there's a lot of, I don't know if there are real standards for security in the cloud, but certainly Amazon, which is who we use, does have pretty good best practices that they force you to follow. Most of the provisioning is done over secure links to their API. When you're connecting to the raw instances, it's always over SSH. Obviously, you can take away security if you want, but the default is fairly secure, so we're happy with it.
John, any comments on security?
Well, when we're just, as a company, we had 6 paid betas that we did in November. We just broadened out, did a beta launch of our, what we call CloudSwitch Explorer, which is a free product, really to kind of help people figure out what the cloud means to them and their organization. The way I describe it is kind of, I think 2010 is a year of cloud exploration, where people they know there's a light switch on the wall somewhere, and they're kind of feeling around, and they're trying to figure out, what does this mean to me, what does it mean to my organization? And the question became, when we were kind of launching a little more publicly what we are and what we're doing, kind of letting people know about our story, the question was, what were some of our key positioning points? And one of our venture capitalists was really pushing the notion of security. And to me, this might sound a little heresy, but security to me is going to be table stakes in relatively short order, meaning that it's going to be the minimum barrier to entry in terms of companies in the cloud space. So positioning your company as kind of the most secure solution. I mean, I guess it worked a little bit for Firefox as an entry because of sort of all the browser sort of breaches that people had. But for a cloud company, you're going to need to be secure. But by the way, let me kind of sound the alarm. There will be a breach in security that will be notable, and that will be kind of front page, that people will talk about at some point by some company in the cloud space. It's natural when there's platform shifts. When there's platform shifts, there are the early days. There are things that happen that people that become kind of all the naysayers will glom onto it and say, see, you can't trust that platform. It happened with Windows. It happened with the internet. I mean, it's easy to forget now when you go to Amazon and do one-click purchasing, but to go back in the late 90s, there was this big debate about whether people would put their credit cards on the web. And so I think it's a natural shift. Lots of technology being developed. I mean, when we move data, it's in transit it's secure, it's encrypted, and at rest it's encrypted. There's best practices. For example, Amazon doesn't have the encryption keys, nor do we keep them. You as a customer keep the encryption keys. So even if people did get the data, it's encrypted. So there's going to be normal best practices. There will be technology. Security will continue to be an issue for a while, but as people get more and more comfortable, it's going to be kind of accepted that security kind of is there.
And in some ways, there may be even more security if you've got experts handling it versus the regular small corporation that might have a couple of IT staff members.
Exactly.
Right.
I remember very succinctly about 5, 6 years ago, there was a company in Germany. In my prior company, we were going to host kind of a lot of content for 3D models that people might want to share. And I remember this was a large German company in the component space, making actuators and kind of linear motion accelerator types of things. And I remember talking to the CIO, and he's like, well, we won't do it unless you'll offer an on-premise solution that we can host ourselves. And I said to him, with all due respect, what makes you think that you're going to be able to provide a more secure solution than I will? And I don't say that out of arrogance, I just say it out of pure business facts. Whatever the best solutions are for security, I'm going to be able to amortize it over thousands of customers, and you're going to be trying to do it for one in-house solution. My guess is we're going to have a probably more secure solution simply because economically we can afford to do that. And I think the same thing, people will get, ultimately I found out they came back, and after 4 years of debating it, they finally went with kind of the hosted solution instead of an on-premise solution. So I think the same thing's going to happen here, that people will accept that the cloud providers and companies, generally speaking, will provide better storage. That being said, there will absolutely be a security breach that will be the poster child. It happens with every platform shift that people will point to and say, that's why you shouldn't move to the cloud. But the economic benefits and the agility benefits and the security problems will get solved. And people will get more further along the maturity scale, if you will, in terms of adopting security, is going to just accept it.
Let me ask you real quick, John, if for your German company you got tied in with their ROI on that, and ROI, as was used last night, risk of incarceration, did you indemnify in any way? Because again, you lose the data. Oh, we're going to give you your money back. No, that's what people are worried about. They don't want their money back. They want the $10 million they lost, or the lawsuits that they're going to suffer now, or whatever. They want that back.
No, it's a real issue, and I guess the point.
And you can't,
of course,
providers can't do it.
Of course, they can't identify that company for that. But what I'm saying is, I think the broader benefits of the cloud overall, in time, solutions will get better security-wise. Practices will get better. Examples of encryption keys not being in the holder of the cloud or the company that's helping them, but actually in the customer's hands. Which
just the NSA backdoor will be there, so it's all good.
Right. Obama will take care of that. But that over time, that will get accepted, and people will move up that sort of scale to be comfortable with it. And what will become obvious to people is the business agility and economic benefits of moving to the cloud will force them to move. It'll just force them to move. I mean, take the average company right now. If you want to get a server, if you're kind of an engineering team and you need a couple extra servers, if you want to go and get that done in most companies, you're not talking about, oh, ask the IT guy and get it a couple hours later. You're talking sometimes weeks. Weeks. Well, guess what? Engineers are creative people. They're not going to sit around and wait. They're just going to go out to Amazon. They're going to go do it themselves. They'll find a way. So my bet is the IT people are actually going to be forced over the next year to 2 years to find ways to try and control that internally. Because it's happening already. Whether they like it or not, it's happening. IT, this is the big myth, that IT people can, the CIOs can control all this. You can't. It's happening already. People are going around the corporate standards. They're going to Amazon, provisioning servers and doing stuff already. That's why Amazon's growing the way it has in terms of S3 and EC2.
But it's all going to come back to IT, though. Just like everything else the business does on their own, eventually it gets big and expensive, and they come to IT and they grovel and ask you to take it back.
Right. That's the question is.
The question is how it's going to come back.
It will come back. You're absolutely right.
So it's going to cost more, and it's going to be painful, and you're going to have to undo.
Or you're going to have to find ways to accept why did they want to move, and find ways to embrace it rather than
got to
fight it.
scratch that itch.
I mean, I think that's why you're seeing the internal clouds, right? Host your own cloud on infrastructure from the larger companies coming out, IBM and all the big server providers.
That's a whole other discussion.
And that's another discussion, but it takes all the economic benefits, gives it to the big company, puts it in your data center, in your control. Very interesting maturity model that you're seeing happen there.
Yeah, I mean, the whole discussion about private clouds is, to me, I think that it's great marketing by a lot of the existing big hardware guys to sort of play into the fear that people have about the external cloud. The economic benefits of the public cloud are undeniable. They clearly can be more expensive if you left the biggest servers on all the time, but the whole benefit of the cloud is being able to turn things on and off. And I think the notion of a private cloud, sure, that's going to evolve into this concept of whatever people want to call a hybrid cloud, and being able to facilitate both is really what's going to be important. People don't want to, when people look at the cloud, they don't want to put in a whole other infrastructure management system. They already have tools for authentication, for provisioning. They want to use their BMCs, their Blade Logics, their Opera. They want to use their existing tools. They just want the economic benefits and the business agility benefits of the public cloud. And they want to take all this excess capacity that they might have had because they over-provisioned in the past and take that and sort of say, okay, can we pool those together and give the benefits to the organization that they would get if they went out to a public cloud by allowing them to be able to kind of get these excess VMs and have self-service. That's the real kind of key thing that people want. The end users ultimately will revolt otherwise, and they've proven that.
So what does the CIO do, or the CEO, when this great new product development comes to be presented, and the people admit that they developed this not based on internal resources, but they went and used resources with their credit card on some cloud, some place. What does
he
the
do?
CEO and CIO do? I mean,
First thing he does is pat the person
Exactly.
on
I think a quarterly award
give him a quarterly award.
for turning CapEx into OpEx.
And just reward the right behavior, which is focusing on the results. And then you take your IT person and say, why the hell is that happening? Why do they even have to look externally?
Didn't the same thing happen when people were buying domains on their credit cards and launching websites and every technology that's come along? There are always early adopters that are sort of pushing it. And
Remember
then,
the PCs coming in the
yeah, and then either IT embraces it or the replacement IT department.
The incoming IT.
Judy, we had a question over here.
So you started to touch on it about whether private clouds versus public clouds. I'm curious that the question of vertical clouds. So I could think of payment processors as a great example of cloud-based services, right? It grows by the nature of who participates and who's on the network, if you will. So I'm just curious what how the group views industry-specific versus, tiering in the ISO model version of cloud-based offerings. You talk about, bare metal all the way up to applications, but then there's applications by industry. How do you all predict this will break out?
I would argue that it will, an awful lot of it will be driven by the ability to have interoperability between clouds, whether that's particularly the vertical stuff. If you look at functioning within a particular environment, and then you want to pass your stuff, have some level of communication with another environment. So clouds, talking about our clouds. That's kind of where web services has been pushing and addressing and trying to do. You abstract what's going on here to the point that you can talk to it over here. I think that's you have to agree on what you're doing, what you want to do, what you want to pass, and the best way you get the advantage from that when you actually have good standards, and they're often industry-specific standards. So you'll find that the normal IT standardization organizations can't really do that well. That what you want is get your 5 competitors and your 20 suppliers that are most important to you together to take care of these things. XML did this thing. XML's great. You got to have it. Oh wait, you need a schema underlying it, and it's important to understand that schema within your industry. And so you want to, so it becomes, you have to get together to decide on what the definition of these things are. I think in clouds you're going to see, an exact replay of that kind of.
And there is a trend, Ben, to your question. There is a trend. They actually call it community sourcing, where like the financial services industry is getting together. What are those elements that are? We know that we have to do them, but they're hygienic, but they're not. Their context's not core. And so that they are actually coming together, and they will probably use, if you will, cloud technology to make that stuff happen.
I absolutely think you'll have some vertical clouds that happen. It's natural because it's where the economies of scale start to happen, where everybody benefits. I think an example I'd give is sort of medical research. I think to the extent that you can take clinical data, you can sort of strip out the specifics of any individual patient, but characteristics. Harvard Medical School and Partners Healthcare have been working on things called I2B2, which is sort of a large data set that allows drug discovery guys to sort of run a bunch of analysis against sort of this, I'll call it sort of stripped down data, if you will, and then the ability to then take it back and bring it specific to clinical data to compare theoretical versus real models. I think that's a classic example where you'll see sort of verticals emerge. I could imagine, I was at a conference last week where we were at Cloud Connect in the West Coast, and somebody talked about a company, actually it's the guys that make Taser, that there's this whole system that they built for crime and for criminal sort of cloud database for criminal information and actual crimes that happen real time, kind of the whole process from the police officer sort of stopping a vehicle to everything else happening to all that being digital, all the digital media being stored in the cloud. And I can imagine that criminal database sort of sources would happen. So I think you will start to see some verticals. But I think the horizontal approach initially is going to be kind of our major focus in terms of real business traction. But longer term, it absolutely will verticalize.
John, how do you define a private cloud?
You got a couple hours? I think there's a huge debate, and I think you got to look at the vested interests of the different parties that talk about a private cloud. My belief is the following. The reason people are looking to the cloud as a platform is people want agility and they want economics of the cloud. And the economics of the cloud are essentially shared resources. And that's why security becomes the big issue. Doug talked about virtualization and this idea of multi-tenancy. My wife says, what's multi-tenancy? I said, well, imagine that, we have this big house and we have a front walkway. We have to pay somebody $100 to shovel that walkway. Now imagine we turn our house into 4 apartments and we have to pay $100 to clear that pathway. But now that's $25 per family instead of $100 per family. That's the economic benefit that's happening with multi-tenancy, virtualization in the cloud today. With that, people worry about, well, can our neighbor break into our apartment because we're on the same floor? Possibly, but there's a bunch of security things that have been done in that sort of nature of things. So if you understand that concept, think about the economics of a company. What's happened right now is IT, VMware has done a fabulous job in virtualization. And they're the default standard for virtualization in most enterprises. What has happened up until now is companies had a lot of servers, and because of the instability of operating systems, a lot of people would put only one application per server. When VMware came along, this idea of virtualization allowed you to take that one server, instead of having it be one server, it made it look like it was 8 servers, because you virtualized and put virtual machines on that server. So all of a sudden now, planning for overcapacity, people have some excess VMs inside their data center. And kind of the big guys are a little bit afraid of the cloud as well, so they've kind of helped push this concept of a private cloud. And so what's happening now in VMware, very smartly, it absolutely makes sense for them to have been, full bore pushing this idea of a private cloud, because they've had trouble getting the cloud providers to put up VMware-based clouds. And so they're sort of afraid of Microsoft coming up underneath with their hypervisor product, the Hyper-V product, and basically eroding their VMware-based hypervisor. So they're saying, put a cloud around there. They're trying to move up the stack to be kind of a management pane or control pane. They're saying, take all these excess virtual machines and make that your private cloud. And with that, they're trying to kind of put a fence around that IT base and the data center. I do think a lot of people are going to try and do that, because if I've already invested in it, it's a sunk cost, why not try to get some flexibility out of it? You still have the kind of the core depreciation. The question is, will people add a lot more machines to that private cloud? And that's where I think there's a big question. I think that's where they're going to look at it and sort of say, wait, before we buy more machines, why don't we look and try and use public clouds? So I think that's where it'll emerge, or it'll move towards this notion of a hybrid cloud, where you'll have some of the on-premise stuff where you can use your existing capacity, and there's going to have to be a great deal of work done by VMware to make it easy for companies to be able to allow users to provision those machines like they can on Amazon and in other clouds. And then I think you'll see a combination of that of public clouds.
So you might argue that a metric that a company would use, whether or not even consider public cloud solutions, would be to look at their own server and utilization rates and decide whether or not they got it. They just need to use it better, more efficiently, more effectively, rather than go out. Well, what was the number? 12% is the average. Would you say that the well-run companies that are higher, and those are the ones that are more of a candidate for using the cloud as it's being promulgated down? Whereas if you're down at 10 or 12%, right? You don't need the cloud. You need a better IT department that knows how to virtualize.
So the dirty little secret about virtualization is that while it gets better utilization of your hardware, almost nobody goes and virtualizes without buying new hardware. So the first thing
that supports the virtualization.
Right, exactly. So for people who have existing capacity that's not virtualized, chances are for them they're not going to virtualize. They'll virtualize some, but they'll probably look more towards public clouds because they have to go and buy all that new hardware to go and virtualize. And there's a capital expense associated with that. And the benefit of the cloud is that it's an OpEx expense versus a CapEx expense. So that's one. But for people who have a lot of existing virtualization, VMs and they're pretty well along the path of virtualization. I think by the very nature of that, they have to ask the argument internally, what are we doing about the excess capacity we have? Will we use it? Now, there are challenges to making a private cloud. There's an open source company called Eucalyptus that is trying to help people build private clouds. And VMware is pushing to try and create their own vCloud. They're still kind of, I'd say, in their infancy stages. But by the very nature of our business, we're going to have to support both because people will take some of those excess VMs. It's natural. the resistance to move to new technology will force them to take that as a first step for some companies.
I think, the biggest benefit of the private cloud is that it shifts the decision-making away from the IT staff to the people that are actually building the applications or the products that the company needs. So it makes it more agile as a result. If I need a new server, I can just create one on the fly as I need it, rather than, going to IT and waiting for a week for them to provision it, or what have you. If they have an API, I just use that. As an engineer, I like to automate everything. And the cloud basically lets me automate hardware, which is a very powerful thing.
We doing okay for time?
We've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes, any?
Unless you're a very large company, I don't think you're going to be able to statistically get to the utilization rates with a private cloud that the public cloud providers can achieve. Just because of the cyclical nature of your own business versus them being able to integrate all of those cycles, all those very different businesses to a much higher utilization rate.
I agree, and you won't be able to justify, in my opinion, the core competency of your IT department to become a cloud provider and cloud management provider versus basically saying, why is it that we don't make our own hardware anymore, right? In the days, remember how many hardware providers there were back in the 80s and 90s? I mean, people, it's a natural evolution of technology, and there's no way a medium-sized company can afford the management overhead to have a cloud manager, provider, staff. It just doesn't make economic sense.
That's actually an argument for globalization. In that way, the sun is always up on some part of your development crowd, and your customers are always awake and buying somewhere. And so you can flatten out your.
That's during the day, but during the year, because a lot of businesses are very busy, and in December,
Christmas rush,
yeah,
etc.
exactly.
Let's see what we have.
Yes, sir.
Since we're talking about infrastructure, a lot of the larger applications these days tend to be pretty complicated. You sort of talk about you're a startup, you throw a server up into the cloud, it works like this good. But the kind of applications I'm thinking about, there are front ends and middle ends and data pools and load balancers and all those sorts of things. So if you're actually rolling out a sophisticated application for tens or hundreds of thousands of users, how easy is that to port to the cloud? Does all of that go away because the cloud magically takes care of it? Or are there mechanisms to deal with that sort of thing in the cloud infrastructure at the moment? Or is it more of somebody was referring to an experimental place where you could play with some things, but maybe it doesn't actually scale to running a large enterprise unless you're doing a software platform like Salesforce where they're taking care of all that for you as part of their software?
It might actually be useful to looking at just one thing you mentioned, a load balancer. In the cloud, load balance is not needed because to load balance you either expand the size of your VM or simply start up more. It doesn't. Cloud maps well to some applications and not well to others. The ones that it maps to, all the old parallel processing kinds of arguments apply. If you have lots and lots of data localization, then it becomes very hard to parallelize that across many, many different machines. I think actually why the cloud looks attractive to so many people is because it is an awful lot of the load of computing these days is parallelizable. You can spread it, you can horizontally expand and address the issue. If this, web surfing is probably one of the kind of 10-year-old, but one of the biggest applications that one needed to do and do well, and you just throw more machines at it. It's not hard at all. So you don't really need load balancing so much as a horizontal scalability and to know when somebody's dead, so you just time out and go to someone else. What you're talking about are complex, large applications, and they're not going to go to the cloud anytime soon because of that. Those sort of the internal workings that are finely tuned to the platform that they're running on, to the environment that they're running on, and to the use that they're put to. So I think that's the that's the tail end. Those are the hard things that will to move to the cloud. Unless the cloud actually provides them themselves. I mean, that's where Salesforce.com. CRM is a complicated thing.
Right.
Salesforce.com does the whole thing for you, right? So they do all the complications and all the load balancing and everything else. But so you don't have to worry about it. But I wouldn't argue that Salesforce.com is a classic cloud instantiation and cloud environment.
But a lot of the big players, kind of F5 for example, they're trying to figure out kind of what is their world and what's their role to play in the cloud. So I do think over time you're going to see solutions available to move some of these large honking applications, and some of the existing players are going to find a way to add value in that process.
It depends a lot on your application too. If there is a cloud provider out there that does exactly what you want to do, and your app is in the sweet spot. For example, yesterday somebody mentioned Heroku. Heroku is basically a way for you to deploy your Ruby on Rails application in the cloud, and it will handle all the load balancing issues and whatnot for you. You just spin up as many instances as you need. However, if you're building an app that does not fit in that sweet spot and you need to do something very custom, you're going to need some kind of system architecture. You can still do that in the cloud, and I've done that in the cloud. You basically, you plan out your architecture in the cloud just like you would on your own hardware, except you get the benefit of automating the provisioning of those machines and automating the scaling of those machines. And that's a pretty big win when you do need to scale.
Well, let's give our panel a round of applause.